Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon. Welcome to our seminar of the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies and the Illiberalism Studies Program. My name is Marlène Laruelle. I'm the director of the Institute, and it's my pleasure to receive here our dear colleague Benjamin Tromly, who is professor at the Puget Sound University and has been working on the history of the white Russian immigration and how they got recruited in the US. He has a really excellent book I recommend you on Cold War exiles and how this white Russian worked during the Cold War decades for a CIA project. But here today is here to discuss something that is more contemporary, which is the place of General Vlasov personality in post-Soviet Russian collective memory. And as you can imagine, with the war in Ukraine, it has become an even more sensitive topic than it was before, given the way Russia has been instrumentalizing and weaponizing the accusation of collaborationism in Ukraine as a tool for its invasion. The way this kind of collaborationist moment is discussed on the Russian side is very sensitive, and the Russian regime has been so much trying to secure its narrative on the Great Patriotic War that there is really a growing limited room for discussing what collaborationism was. But Benjamin will be able to tell us much more here. So I would like to welcome him here. This is a forthcoming article that you will be able to read in a few months, and it's very nice for him to come here and give us some insight on his ongoing research. Benjamin will be talking for about half an hour, and then we will have enough time for questions, both in the room and online. Benjamin, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Laruelle. I'm thrilled to be able to present here and this exciting program in Illiberalism Studies. So as was mentioned, this is a forthcoming article. It's part of a bigger project on Vlasov, the Vlasov forces in history and in memory, and looking at the interconnections of the two. The piece I'm talking about today is really the memory piece, how Vlasov was understood after 1991. And this was the product of, during the pandemic, realizing that Russian newspapers were digitized. Huge numbers of Russian newspapers were digitized, and I could enter the keyword Vlasov and read hundreds of articles and try to make sense of the different kinds of narratives that have existed since 1991. And I discovered that there were many interesting debates about Vlasov. Vlasov served many functions in discourse after 1991, and I'll explore some of those today, ranging from the literary world, the sphere of kind of pro-Putin think tanks, the Orthodox Church, the historical profession. So very broad range of materials I've been kind of looking at. And I think there's kind of two paradoxes I want to explore. One of which I'm still somewhat figuring out. The first paradox is why Vlasov in the first place? Why would there be passionate debate and divided opinion about Vlasov? Vlasov, you may or may not know, I'll introduce him briefly, is one of the most hated figures in modern Russia. He, as the highest ranking Red Army officer to serve the Germans and the head of a Nazi-sponsored Russian Liberation Army, Vlasov has come to symbolize wartime collaboration and even national betrayal as such, starting in the Soviet period, of course. Most of all, given the kind of hegemonic status of the construct of the Great Patriotic War in Russia after, in Putin's Russia at least, it would seem surprising that Vlasov would receive so many divided opinions in Russia after 1991. And then, of course, the Vlasov movement, I think it's safe to say, was a dismal affair. Here was a celebrated general, agreed to fight on the side of the Germans during the war, and of course was relentlessly manipulated, as most collaborators with the Nazis were. He essentially became a propaganda figurehead in Nazi propaganda directed both at the Red Army the Soviet home front with leaflets being dropped over the border and whatnot, and also prisoners of war in Germany and the population of occupied Soviet territories. Of course, Hitler had no wish to empower a Russian leader. And therefore, Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army was essentially a propaganda fiction for much of the war. It was only in late 1944 when, of course, there were no Germans on Soviet territory, and the outcome of the war was basically set, that Vlasov received a position of some authority. He came to head a committee called the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, which managed to partially fill a few divisions of armed forces. And of course, after the war, along with several of his other commanders, Vlasov was captured by the Red Army and eventually executed for treason in Moscow. So we have here a figure essentially is a national villain, and one whose actual history was probably not incredibly substantial. So the first kind of paradox, why Vlasov? I try to locate the kind of interest in Vlasov in the confusion. So a villain whose impact on history was minimal. The place of the Soviet period in Russian national identity after 1991. So my argument here is that some memory entrepreneurs, people who wanted to make new claims about national memory and were unsatisfied with the Great Patriotic War, precisely for its Soviet pedigree, sought to narrate the war from the perspective of the Russian people instead of the Soviet state. And for them, they found Vlasov to be a useful figure to create kind of counter narratives on the Great Patriotic War. And that leads me to the second paradox, which will come through as I work through as I talk about the different narratives that have existed after 1991. This paradox is why Vlasov has been so heavily debated, and yet the Great Patriotic War construct has really remained very solid, especially in its role in justifying the war in Ukraine most recently, of course. So that the full answer on that will come kind of at the end of the comments. So I want to outline the different discourses that I discuss in this article. And I want to stress that I see these as narratives. I'm working in the kind of tradition of history of memory here. Narratives understood to be accounts of the past that are usable in the present. I'm not interested here in reaching a verdict on Vlasov or Vlasov's forces. That's not my agenda. My agenda is to think about why different understandings of Vlasov have appealed to Russians in 1991 in different parts of society. So to give a kind of overview of these narratives that I discover, I want to start with the intelligentsia and perestroika. And the narrative here, I kind of label Vlasov as a symbol of the suffering Russian people. This narrative, in fact, really, I think, started with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who in the Gulag Archipelago, which of course was distributed in the Soviet Union, talked about meeting survivors of the Vlasov forces who had gone through the Gulag. And Solzhenitsyn looks at these people and he stands the Soviet allegations of disloyalty upside down. He said, it's not the Vlasovites who betrayed Russia. It's the Soviet state that betrayed these soldiers, right? Stalin, had sacrificed armies meaninglessly. He had treated prisoners of war as traitors, and therefore, he doesn't justify collaboration as such or the Vlasovites' decisions, but he says these are understandable. These people their actions have to be understood as part of a kind of Russian story of victimhood in the 20th century. He says the worst thing in the world was to be a Russian. in the 20th century. So this narrative had some influence probably in the late Soviet period and then burst out during Perestroika, with, of course, Gorbachev's easing of censorship. The cause célèbre of this narrative, which, whoops, this is Vlasov, of course. The cause célèbre is a novel by the emigre Russian novelist Georgy Vladimov, called The General and His Army, which was published in the early 1990s. The novel depicts the predicament of a semi-fictional Soviet general who had emerged from the Gulag and then is fighting the Nazis, but in fact being hounded by the Soviet authorities and the secret police. The important thing here is that this book was understood to be a book about Vlasov for audiences in the early 1990s. And Vlasov actually makes a cameo role. He goes to a church while he's still fighting on the Soviet side. He goes to a church, pays his respects, and then goes to fight the Germans. And then, in fact, the main character of this novel, the kind of plot includes this general refusing to try to take a position on the battlefield, which is defended by Russian collaborators, because he thinks this would constitute a crime against Russia itself. So the idea here, and I think the reason why this was such a critical success, this book was very widely read and discussed in the period, is that the book connected with this narrative, kind of connecting to Solzhenitsyn, this idea of World War II and a double victimhood. This idea that the Soviet people, and now increasingly seen as the Russian people, had won the war against Nazism despite the cruelty and incompetence of the Soviet state. And in this context, Vlasov fit in surprisingly quite well. Vlasov was a tragic, but nonetheless understandable figure. The idea being that in such a horrific war, the lines between national loyalty and betrayal were thin, porous, and situational. Therefore, collaborators should not be condemned as traitors, but reintegrated into a national history, a national narrative of the war. And in this context, I argue, in fact, reinterpreting collaboration in this way was actually a part of building a democratic Russia, recovering a real collective memory, a more inclusive collective memory that would get rid of the supposedly false Great Patriotic War narrative. So that's the kind of first narrative that I look at. As you can imagine, this narrative caused extreme blowback in the Russian context. And here it's important to note that the idea of Vlasov as still being a traitor was incredibly strong in this period and in the 1990s, and then became kind of increasingly dominant under Putin. And I want to outline that there are many articulations of this re-emphasis on Vlasov as traitor, but I want to emphasize, or just to bring as an example, a criticism of Vladimov's book by a writer, a novelist, and a Great Patriotic War veteran, Bogomolov. And he alleged that The General and His Army was an apology for Russian invaders, a slander of the entire generation of Soviet people who had fought in the war. He rejects this idea that you could somehow frame the World War II as a story of common suffering that included both people on both sides, Russians on both sides of the front. And instead, he says that the battle lines were clear. He refers to the fact that Vlasovites were often shot on the battlefield out of hand, which is in fact true. Moreover, and interestingly, Bogomolov attempts to rehabilitate Vlasov to the pathologies of Russia in the 1990s. He talks about a generational divide. He blasts young people of his day who were involved in criminal razborki, criminal goings on, and he, young people who criticized Great Patriotic War veterans as having been cannon fodder, rabble, or simply Stalinist zombies. So this is really a narrative that connects or situates Vlasov as a kind of symbol of past and current betrayal in Russia. This narrative is predictably taken up, especially by the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. And then interestingly, it gains, I think, credence in the course of the 1990s with the economic collapse, political chaos, the Chechen War, and so on. And of course, as we know, Yeltsin in the mid-1990s turned back to commemoration of World War II. And so it fits into that kind of period, or that kind of development. Of course, as you might imagine, with Putin, this anti-Vlasov discourse hardens and takes on increasing domestic political uses. So in the new patriotism espoused by the Putin state, victory in the war was the centerpiece. A correct reading of the war was essentially a litmus test of loyalty to the national community in popular discourse. And as with Bogomolov, any attempt to reconsider wartime history in fundamental ways, especially touching on Vlasov, was viewed as being kind of an echo of the political chaos of the 90s, as so much in Putin's discourse was, right? Overcoming the 90s, the crazy, chaotic 90s. And of course, the causes of which were the collapse of empire, which was to be regretted, and the influence of the West. Increasingly, as Putin has been in power, what Olga Malinova calls a securitized discourse on memory also became very important in discussions of Vlasov, or even mentions of Vlasov. And here, of course, the context is very important, the political war over memory between Russia and other former Soviet republics. In which, of course, the Putin government and public intellectuals opposed anti-Soviet narratives on World War II that were arising in Ukraine, in the Baltic states, and accused them of being neo-Nazi falsifications of history. Of course, that's connected to the memory law that was then passed by the government, which actually criminalized lies about the activities of the Soviet Union in World War II. In this context, this broader context of an international clash over war memory, of course, emphasizing Vlasov, who's the symbol of Russian ethnic collaboration, appeared to be nothing less than a threat to national security. And one definitely sees that in the discourse of the time, in which, this is just to take one quotation, the idea of reviving a positive memory of Vlasov is essentially seen as an instrument of information war against the Russian state. So now we have this perestroika narrative, this extremely harsh counter narrative of Vlasov still being a traitor, which increases over time in the Soviet period. But what I found was interesting in my research is that these weren't the only two narratives. And the third narrative is, I think, a particularly fascinating one, Vlasov as a secret agent. And this one really surprised me. The most quixotic post-Soviet narrative on Vlasov was the idea that the general had not been a collaborator at all, but in fact, a Soviet spy fulfilling a top secret mission for Stalin. The popularization of this spy thesis was carried out by a man named Filatov, who was a very high-ranking officer in the Russian army. And in a series of articles in 1995, he made this case that Stalin had infiltrated Vlasov into the Third Reich in order to prevent Hitler from mobilizing prisoners of war or playing the Russian card on the Eastern Front. So in other words, the failure of Vlasov's Russian Liberation Army was deliberate in this narrative, right? It was all part of a secret intelligence operation. Filatov also connected this to extreme anti-Semitism. He claimed that Vlasov was not just a Soviet super spy, but a Russian hero, an all-Slavic brainchild who was exploited by the Soviet state, which he presents as being a conspiracy of Zionists with the collective farm kibbutzes and Central Committee Kahal. So there you have it. So this interesting narrative on a conspiracy theory, which was an articulation of extreme anti-Sovietism, rejecting the Soviet state, but interestingly enough, in Filatov's case, maintains a sense of kind of Russian heroism, right? Stalin and Vlasov are good figures. And as I see it, this narrative, it's almost a way to maintain some sort of pride in Russia's record in World War II, despite the fact that he's denouncing the Soviet state in extremely anti-Semitic terms. And what I found was interesting is that these narratives about Vlasov as a spy circulate widely, even in intelligentsia discourse in post-Soviet Russia. So it's a very interesting kind of counter conspiracy theory kind of account. And why would this emerge was the question, of course, that came to me. Of course, historians reject this narrative of Vlasov as spy out of hand, surely correctly. And I think I've trying to make sense of this. I think it's important to point out that many scholars have pointed to the rise of conspiratorial thinking in this period, most recently Scott Radnitz's book. If we think of conspiracy theories as a sense-making behavior undertaken in response to periods of crisis, it makes some sense that there were these kinds of conspiracy theories might exist. But then going beyond that, and to Vlasov in particular, I think what the reasoning here might be is that there was so much rebuking or dismantling of World War II myths or supposed myths during the war, such as, the Panfilov division and many other cases. So I think some Soviet or post-Soviet Russians thought, well, if Soviet wartime myths are fabrications, propaganda fabrications, perhaps myths of betrayal are also fabrications. So there's a kind of effort to try to make sense. So I think these conspiracy theories have served kind of a radical nationalist agenda, anti-Semitic agenda, but at the same time, for some people, is just an attempt to kind of make sense of a confused national history. And that brings me to what I think is maybe the most perhaps important narrative on Vlasov, and here I connect to Professor Laruelle's book with Margarita Karnashova about white narratives in post-1991 Russia, but the idea of Vlasov as an honorary white Russian, perhaps, right? Of course, we know he was a Red Army general, but this narrative comes from this idea that Vlasov, somehow is a supporter of the heritage of the old Russia that fought during the Russian Civil War. And what I found is that there were two major scandals that invoked or dealt with this white perspective on Vlasov. One in the church and one in history. And I imagine the one in history, some people might know quite a bit about. But I want to take a minute to talk about the church in this regard, because I think it's a very interesting part of the story about Vlasov. So the Vlasov question emerged in the church through what some scholars have called a liberal subculture, a small kind of loose collection of clergymen and Orthodox laypeople who have articulated the need for kind of national repentance after communism and have been critical of the compromises that the church has made with secular authority both before and after 1991. And so the key figure here and the source of the scandal was the archpriest Mitrofanov, who was a professor at the St. Petersburg Theological Academy. In 2009, he wrote a book called The Tragedy of Russia, Forbidden Themes in 20th Century History. And what's interesting is in a text that merges religious language and historical analysis, Mitrofanov basically makes a claim that there needs to be not just a condemnation of communism, but a contemporary kind of overcoming of communism. I think of it as kind of a religious version of the German view of coming to terms with the past, perhaps. And as part of this, Mitrofanov comes to support the Vlasovites. And he goes far beyond the kind of Solzhenitsyn account of seeing these people as tragic figures, right? He goes into praise and even kind of Christian defense of the Vlasovites in religious terms. So he makes this startling claim. He says about the Vlasovites, of course they were traitors, because in 1917, they found themselves among those who destroyed the Russia that their ancestors had served. They were traitors for a quarter of a century, And their realization of this circumstance, occurring in the extreme conditions of war and especially imprisonment, made them rethink their lives in many ways. So the Vlasovites are traitors because they fought in the Red Army, not because they were they collaborated with the Germans. So this is a radical claim, and he also sees them as martyrs of a sort, Vlasov, right? He sees Vlasov as going to his death willingly to repent for their communist past, essentially, that Vlasov made this act. The Vlasov and his fellow Vlasovites had shown that a path to historical Russia still existed under the atheistic dictatorship of Stalin. So kind of willing martyrdom in the name of the old Russia is how Mitrofanov presented the Vlasovites. So as you might imagine, based on what I've already said, the idea of collaboration as Christian repentance was not welcomed in Putin's Russia. And you know, of course, in a sense, Mitrofanov's claim about Vlasov is a direct attack against Putin's politics of memory, which tell the Russian people to be proud of Soviet accomplishments, but also to be proud of Russia's longer history and you know, to cross the 1917 divide in terms of their patriotic commitments. So this was clearly an extremely oppositional text, but it was also a very troubling text for the church to address and for wider Russians to address, so the Russian establishment. Just 2 years before this book was published, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, or Rokor, the part of the church that of course had rejected the USSR and remained in exile during the Soviet period, had reunited with the Moscow Patriarchate at a canonical communion ceremony, which was triumphantly overseen by Putin. The problem, of course, is that, or not of course, the problem is that the Russian Orthodox Church abroad is pro-Vlasov in its orientation, or at least these pro-Vlasov interpretations have a deep history, as you see, to the only monument to Vlasov, which I'm aware of, which is outside of a convent in New York State. And so immediately, Rokor came out with a statement defending Vlasov. This was extremely troubling for many in the church. In fact, I argue that many figures in the church were put in a very awkward position because there were, of course, very strong anti-communist moods in the church, right? That was, in a sense, the essence for many parts of the church in the post-Soviet period has been a rejection of communism. So on one hand, there was great sympathy towards Mitrofanov. Mitrofanov was not a peripheral figure. He was involved in the very important process of the re-sanctification of the martyrs, this process of granting statehood to clergymen who had been killed by the communist regime. And so this was a very difficult position. On the other hand, you have many pro-Soviet, pro-Stalin clergy and lay people close to the church who, of course, view this as sacrilege, that it's, including the patriarch. That this Patriarch Kirill, that arguing that this is essentially a sinful act to even question the battle, the lines of loyalty and disloyalty during World War II. So I'm running short on time. I'll just mention briefly that the Vlasov question also came into the historical profession with a scholar, a St. Petersburg scholar called Kirill Alexandrov, who has written very extensively about the Vlasov forces and done a lot of extremely detailed work on this topic. In 2015, Alexandrov defended a doctoral defense in the St. Petersburg division of the Academy of History, and this created scandal. So many patriotic people, including veterans organizations, protested actively this dissertation defense, and in fact also tried to push this this case into the sphere of the criminal system. Denunciations being made to the authorities, and eventually the higher attestation committee that grants higher degrees in Russia intervened and basically overturned the decision of the historians in St. Petersburg and revoked the doctoral degree. So this shows, of course, the high stakes of debate on Vlasov and Putin's Russia, and also the difficulty of imposing a kind of orthodoxy when even very well-respected scholars were willing to grant this, this degree. Not really because they sympathized with Vlasov, or with Alexandrov's interpretation of Vlasov, I should say, but more because they thought this was solid research and that it deserved the degree. So to conclude, how are we to make sense of these debates in which the ghost of Vlasov keeps appearing in different forms throughout the post-Soviet period? And Russians use Vlasov as a figurehead in order to substantiate their own narratives of the Russian 20th century and the post-Soviet present. Well, I think on one level, this shows that memory politics in Russia are a very dynamic affair, that despite state efforts to enforce clear categories of heroes and villains on the Great Patriotic War, a welter of counter-narratives from the 1990s, which depicted Vlasov in many ways as a symbol of suffering, as an adherent of the white cause, or even as a secret agent of Stalin, continued to find adherence and continued to resurface. So this would suggest that it's been very difficult for the Putin regime over its long period of rule to impose a single version of historical truth on society. But here I want to get back to the second paradox that I started my talk with, which is why such diverse discussion on Vlasov really hasn't changed, in my view, the overall view in which Russian society views the history of World War II. And I'd like to make a few suggestions about why that might be the case. And I argue that the narrow focus on Vlasov and his followers has really detracted from more meaningful and potentially reconciliatory discourse on World War II. So far too often, discussion of the Vlasov question has compromised efforts to create a new kind of narrative on on World War II, which might modify the Great Patriotic War. So in other words, the discussions of the war too often are kind of telescoped into narrow discussions of betrayal and the specific actions of specific actors, Vlasov and his followers. So that's one claim I want to make. But then I think there's another claim that I'll make very quickly, which is that these narratives that I've talked about have a dialogical quality. One position almost invites the opposite position. And in fact, these positions have been relatively predictable. They interchange, they seem to invite one another, as I think historical often happens in the sphere of historical memory. So I want to suggest that the debate on Vlasov has been so unproductive, I would argue, because the different positions are in fact all really incomplete and seem unsatisfactory to many Russians who consume or comment on them. It's very hard for many Russians to condemn Vlasov outright, because that seems to be to entail a defense of the Great Patriotic War construct, and seems to be too Soviet, essentially. And it also, there are uncomfortable facts about Stalinist brutality during the war, the scale of Russian collaboration during the war that the Great Patriotic War narrative really passes over. On the other hand, championing Vlasov, however you want to do that, as a victim, a patriot, or a martyr, also threatens to undo the association with victory that's really central to Russian national identity. So I want to end with the statement that the seemingly endless rehashing of unsatisfying positions on Vlasov is symptomatic of a society lost in the Soviet past. And that's, of course, the state of affairs with far-reaching consequences for Russia and the region today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Benjamin. I'm coming here because we need the mic for the people in the room. Thank you so much for this really fascinating presentation. I think it's giving us a lot of food for thought, and I would like to open the floor for questions. I have myself several questions, so maybe I can just launch some of them, and then we will take also some coming from the room. On one of your last points, I would really be interested in having you developing the relationship between discussing Vlasov and discussing Stalinism. And, you know, like collaborationism being seen as a kind of way of reacting to Stalinism and forced collectivization and so on, because that was a key argument. So it's also part of this kind of memory debates, not only about the war, but about Stalinism, right? And that's a kind of a triangle. And then if you could also, something that you also mentioned at the end, that's the fact that there have been so much focus on Vlasov, who was collaborationing abroad, right, outside of the borders, make that there was relatively few discussion about what happened on Nazi-occupied Soviet territories. So the more collaboration is at home, right? And I'm thinking of that, of course, as the French citizen, and how much we had still today in a Western European democratic countries kind of hard time discussing collaborationism and how we want to reintegrate that, right, into the national narrative. Not the issue is usually not about the leaders, but about the kind of everyday citizen finding themselves in difficult situations. And so how that should be integrated as part of the kind of the national building construction. So if you could discuss also the state maybe of the debates in Russia on collaborationism at home, like in occupied Soviet territories, and of course, I mean, in Nazi-occupied Soviet territories, meaning that they were also sometimes Soviet army occupied territories of another country, right? So it's a pretty complicated picture, but that's two of the key elements that I would be happy to maybe get some of your feedback, and then we will take questions from the room. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much. Very important questions. I mean, I think, yeah, in my comments, I didn't stress the Stalinism aspect enough, because that's really the you know, especially if you look at the works of Alexandrov, that's really the core of it, is that the Vlasovites lived through the Great Terror. Some of them had been arrested during the Great Terror, as you would imagine. They were members of the Soviet Officer Corps during the 1930s, right? And collectivization. And then, of course, the complicated factor is that this becomes mediated, because this is part of the way the Vlasovites present themselves, right? And that's part of why my book, I'm thinking about history and memory, because it's really the history of the Vlasovci in presenting themselves and telling their own story, and then external actors, Americans, Germans, others, making those claims that extend that further. And so yes, absolutely, Stalinism is core to the story. The question of collaboration abroad, I think, is a really fascinating one, and I'm interested in perhaps what Professor David Fox might say. But my sense is that there could be, on the one hand, I think it's that's the reason why Vlasov becomes popular and becomes interpreted in so many different ways, is because he's kind of an empty signifier. Right? He doesn't do much. He doesn't really lead armies until the very end, right? And even then, the programmatic statement of the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia is democratic. It praises the February Revolution. Strange under Nazi authority, but in fact, the Nazis were clearly involved in supporting that narrative. Because the war was about to end, and they thought maybe somehow it would be useful if we position the Vlasovci as being democratic, or as, you know, not imposing kind of anti-Semitic and Nazi-style rhetoric on them. So Vlasov is indeed a collaborator abroad, and you can read almost anything into Vlasov, and I think that's exactly what we see after 1991. And the kind of and I imagine that, of course, recently there's been more discussion about that, but I imagine that that's detracted from discussion about collaboration at home and these very powerful and difficult narratives that all European countries have had to deal with. Although I would say that it was interesting to discover that the historical profession was open to these discussions, right? Even Soviet textbooks contained, or sorry, not Soviet, even textbooks in post-Soviet Russia often contained fairly attempts at a kind of a historical objective approach to understanding collaboration. These people were starving in the prisoner of war camps. They were, you know, kind of taking, you know, a kind of historical approach. So I do think there has been an attempt at more historical, objective historical analysis on the Vlasovci, while all the swirling narratives of betrayal are, of course, very prominent in the discourse as well.
Let's open the floor.
You mentioned me, I want to say that the context for my comment is that I finished chapter on collaborationism in homelessness in Russian which philosophy piece, and so I'm more immersed in the history and historiography and memory, and I found your emphasis on several discourses very interesting. And I'd be happy to go deeper into the meaning of that history, but maybe separately. My questions are about 2 points that relate to the kind of intersection between history and memory. One is the kind of terminological, the term traitor, and he's the traitor of the motherland, which in 41 sort of took over enemy of the people that were actively part of it. These are Stalinist terms, and they're terms that were part of the World War II, but also terms of continued. And I'm just making the point that you can kind of tell where someone is on Vlasov just by when they use the term traitor, which is also potentially more objective term than you could trade with other lands. So, I mean, I'm just interested in your thoughts on the preservation of Stalinist terminology. And the second question, you alluded to this at the end about the number of Russian collaborators. It's about a silence in the memory, but also in the historiography. So the post-Soviet historiography kind of reinforces the silence. But I was astounded to learn about the German statistics on the nationality of armed collaborators, which are discussed also by Mark Edeley in his books, but also by German historians. And, you know, Red Army soldiers had a line for nationality in the Mishka, the Red Army booklet, and also if they didn't have it, they were interrogated. And since Ukrainians and others, non-Russians, were favored by the Germans, it's unlikely that German statistics would over themselves. You know, Russian people had a motivation not to say they were Russian. But, you know, we're talking about the vast number of collaborators, relative over 50%, Russians, and the Ukrainians being 16%, and Caucasian nationalities somewhat more, under 20%. So I think that the question is why is this not at all known, even among well-known historians, and partly maybe that historians don't know Russian, but I mean German. So they don't know Russian historians don't list themselves German. So, but I think it also is, maybe that the history of World War II is all about battles, generals, and not sort of that's the look about, but it's not, doesn't get into school curriculum.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. To respond, yes, I think that the term is less izmennik than predator is really the term that one sees over and over again. I think that the Soviet language is so predominant in the articulations of the kind of narratives of almost a kind of stab in the back, the besieged fortress being challenged from within by the Vlasov question. So I think that is certainly part of the story, and I thank you for the need to think about language in this context. In terms of, yes, the silence of memory, I think that's very true what you say, that it's the way that World War II is approached. But one of the things I'm trying to do in my book is to show how stories of collaboration were really Cold War narratives on multiple sides, and they were imported into post-Soviet Russia. So when, I don't mean in any way this to cast aspersions on Kirill Alexandrov, but he's associated with the NTS, the National, the Nacionalny Trudovой Soyuz, Narodny Trudovой Soyuz, so that it's translated in very different ways. But clearly, these are narratives that are taken from the Cold War and on the Western side in the Cold War, narratives in part created by the Vlasovci themselves, right, in the early Cold War, that then were re-imported into post-Soviet Russia. And I think that's one of the reasons why when people think of collaboration, they think, Vlasov, Geroi, or, hero or traitor kind of question. And this very social history, which you alluded to and also Marlene alluded to, kind of might get obscured, right? So I think that, so thank you, I think that's an interesting way for me to be thinking about this for the book.
Follow up on that question of what is treason and how we'll talk about that in debates and all that. I mean, the first thing I think of when I think of volunteers for the Vlasovs is that more than 60% of prisoners of war died during the war. The issues were so horrible that the range of choices was very narrow. But, so I guess the question is, how are memory and structure practice dealing with that sort of question, and more generally the question of the role of genealogy and motive for any of the people involved in this. I think you're alluding to it already, that it's kind of something that was superimposed later through the process of by a handful of massive lessons.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is another reason why Vlasov seems to keep appearing, right? Is because, well, how do you describe the motivations of these people? Scholars, pro-Vlasov scholars tend to think about this as ideological motivation, right? Alexandrov, who I keep referencing, really emphasizes that this was a movement of protest against the Soviet state. And this is exactly Catherine Andreev, which is still kind of the going study, I guess, so on Vlasov. That's essentially the narrative, that this is a movement of ideological protest against the Soviet system. And then, of course, the question is, well, what about the wartime conditions, right? And the motivations, and both sides, I think, have potential difficulty, except for the kind of suffering of the people. That's kind of where that narrative is going. But the pro-Vlasov people have a hard time with that fact that many people did agree to collaborate to save their lives, right? And then the demonization of Vlasov at the same time, it's also an uncomfortable fact, perhaps, that these people were facing certain death, and that maybe their actions in some sense could have been justified in those conditions. So I think that's one of the complexities here, is that the motivations are very unclear, and there's so much room for questioning them and questioning these kinds of narratives. So that's kind of another reason why this has been such a toxic issue and so widely discussed. Yeah, and then I think that's right. I think that on the kind of second part of that question, I'm really focusing on the kind of this the kind of part that's missing in today's talk, I think, is that I see a lot of these narratives coming from the Cold War period and the late Soviet period, the West, and then post 1991, these narratives kind of coming back home and becoming this kind of interesting circular kind of almost discourse that I discussed. So.
If I can follow on that, I think that's a key element. I was thinking of Gavril Popov writing this text about kind of rehabilitating Vlasov. So you really had a group in the perestroika time that were really like pro-NTS, but pro-democratic Russia, I mean, kind of with a clear narrative that we're trying to promote that. So could you kind of disentangle the relationship between a kind of white Russia, I mean, rehabilitation of the whites and the Vlasov issues, because Vlasov was a red general who then defected from Nazi army. So you could imagine, okay, except that some white Russians were pro-Nazi, also then how it got kind of reintegrated into a pro-white narrative while it's originally disconnected from the white memory in itself. I mean, it's not linked to directly the revolution and the civil war. But as you said, it went through the West and then back.
Yes, right? Yes, exactly. And it's and if you, of course, look at the documents from World War II, there was huge mistrust between the leaders of the white immigration and the Vlasovci, right? The Vlasovci were seen as communists, and of course Vlasov was fighting loyally in 1941 you know, and was it would seem to have been a loyal officer of the Red Army. So you know, huge, and then of course the Vlasovci looking at the white immigration as kind of spent forces who only want to come back and get their estates in Russia. This kind of narrative, right? So yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating story. I mean, I think part of that might be the history of the NTS, because the NTS does embody this white tradition, but it came to it came to support the dissidents. It came to support a kind of democratic political language, in part because it was funded by the CIA and it was carrying out American, you know, it was in that position where it was on the payroll of the CIA until virtually the end of the Cold War. So I think and in fact, within the white immigration, I've done a little bit of research on this. Some of the white emigres were furious at the NTS and kind of viewed them as betraying the older white tradition. So I think I think there's a story there in terms of the late Soviet immigration and how these ideas were being bandied around. And then of course the idea of Vlasov as a Democrat, which is an interesting one, but one that they can point to the documents and say, look at the manifesto of the Vlasov movement and say, we're trying to fight for our freedoms that we lost in February 1917. So yes, again, Vlasov is kind of an empty signifier that anyone can attach a kind of ideological cause to.
Add to this very interesting discussion that you know wrote this declaration and all of those speeches were Malenki Zika, who was worked for Bukhara and Zviestia, you know, and was from a social democratic Bolshevik intelligentsia family. It wasn't Vlasov himself. And so it's, you know, I think one point I would make here again about the histories connected to what goes on later is connected to NTS and the Vlasovci and several other endeavors, Mohawks, some of Albania, the Mohawks was on the zone that was seen as a Russian third way, potentially, you know, between Stalinism and Nazism. That whole third way discourse in the immigration was based on the debates going on actually in the occupied territories. And to make it even more complicated, a lot of high-level Germans, both in Rosenberg's Eastern Ministry and in among the army group NITA, right, the center, army group center, were very interested in having a different political solution to the Russian question than Hitler and Goering and so forth. So they were actively encouraging this third way thinking. So
absolutely, yeah, great.
I still have one question if we have time for that. Are you looking also at all the kind of regional variation of the rehabilitation of Vlasov? I'm thinking about all these debates about rehabilitating some of the Cossacks who kind of collaborated with Nazi Germany, and you have kind of also there are kind of strong voices in the region, mostly southern Russia, that have been pushing, you know, for this rehabilitation. So you also have a lot of kind of Cossacks folklore happening around kind of let's rehabilitate these white Cossacks who then collaborated with Nazi Germany. And I think, I mean, at least when I worked on this little book on the white memory, it was interesting to see how much you had regional differences, right? Depending on each region today had a white or red color. And so I would imagine that if you look also at this kind of regional aspect, you would see kind of, different local memories also emerging on, and the Cossacks would be one of them. That would be a kind of pro-Vlasov or pro-collaborationist, but with a local.
Yes.
Color. Yeah.
I'm thinking of two things, slightly different. One is I discovered that some journalists went to his home province of Lomachina in Novgorod province and discovered that many of the locals bought into this idea that Vlasov was in fact a loyal Soviet, and they said, "Oh yeah, someone saw him playing the accordion in Vladivostok in the 1960s. So Vlasov lived, right? He lived, and he was a good Soviet citizen, and So yes, there's a local kind of folklore there, but then there's also this issue of the members who survived of Vlasov, of the Second Army that was decimated in 1942. And there it's a kind of local thing because these people had been discriminated against for being associated with Vlasov to some extent, right? And so I saw a lot of discourse on that of people saying, no, we're not Vlasovci. He ran off and did this, we were fighting. So that's kind of a different take, a kind of counter Vlasov loyalism or localism, I guess you could say, or at least a kind of sub path in this kind of discourse. Path of this discourse that I discovered as well. So.
Do we have more questions? We have questions in the chat. Yeah, I want to give the floor openly to the chat because they have been hacked, which is a sign that there are a lot of people interested in this kind of debate. So I'm not surprised. But yeah, I don't want to open the chat and then those taking the floor. Okay, if there is no more question, I propose we stop here. Benjamin, thank you so much for this great idea. I think it's really needed in the way we are discussing the kind of memory dynamics happening in contemporary Russia. So thank you so much for doing that wonderful work, and combining history and memory, I think, is a really nice way to continue discussing how much history is alive. So thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Benjamin for his presentation.